We are a congregation on a journey of learning and stretching and growing, a journey of deepening our understanding of what it means to be truly welcoming. I hope we're on that journey in many different ways, but this morning I'm talking specifically about our choice to work toward becoming a certified welcoming congregation, a congregation recognized by the Unitarian Universalist Association as having done the work to be fully and genuinely welcoming to folks who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and or transgender. Now, the Welcoming Congregation program has been around for 20 years, over 20 years. So you could say we're running a little behind most other congregations here. I don't think that matters. In some ways, it makes our job a lot easier. 20 years ago, talking about gay and lesbian and bisexual issues was still a real challenge for many of our congregations. Many people didn't know they knew any gay people at all. There were no shows like Will and Grace or Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, no personalities like Ellen DeGeneres, none of the mainstream acceptance that has begun to put real-life gay people into mainstream culture. By now, almost all of us have acquaintances, friends, and family members who are openly gay. So rather than asking, can we welcome gay people here? We're more likely to ask, why do we even need to have this conversation? Well, we do still need to have the conversation because so many religious institutions are so virulently anti-gay still that gay, lesbian, and bisexual people can never assume they are welcome in a religious congregation unless that congregation intentionally makes a statement saying so. Otherwise, there's no way for them to be sure that their full self will be welcome when they come. We still need to be sure that our language, our structure, our bylaws convey the openness and the welcome that we seek to express. Our religious education forms, for example, don't ask for mother and father's names, but for parents. A very important distinction that we might not have thought about had we not had some education around some of these issues. I try to be sure that the illustrations that I use in my sermons lift up different understandings of family, both gay and straight people. We've learned a lot, but we're still learning. And becoming a welcoming congregation is a way of saying publicly that we're willing to keep learning and growing, to be sure that we can be a safe and welcoming home for people who have not traditionally been welcome in religious institutions. But there's a piece of the work of becoming a welcoming congregation that is still foreign to many of us, and that's the piece I want to lift up this morning. Because in addition to the G, the L, and the B, there's that T. T for transgender. And I'm willing to bet that most of us know a lot less about transgender matters and are less comfortable with the T than we are with the G, the B, or the L. But take heart, because another advantage we have in doing this work later than some congregations is that there are much better resources available to us now on transgender issues than there were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I had met exactly one trans person, that I knew of anyway, and that was only within the halls of the extremely liberal Harvard Divinity School. But in the 20 years since I was in seminary, there have been some changes. Not enough changes, not yet. It's still dangerous to be trans. People still lose jobs when they transition. They lose friends. Sometimes they lose their lives when they live openly as a trans person. But more people are openly embracing the fullness of who they are. I have transgender colleagues now serving openly in congregations. 2 of my friends have had children who have transitioned from their biological sex to their chosen gender. I don't have that many friends. 2 of my friends have had this experience. How rare can it really be? The conversation is far more open than it used to be. In a few weeks, as you've heard, we'll have a chance to learn a lot more about it. Our guest on February 5th, Allison Woolbert, is now a woman, but she began her life as a man. During the service, we'll hear her story. And in the workshop that follows, we'll have a chance to explore our own understandings of gender, gender identity, and gender bias. So this morning, I just want to set the stage for that work, to give us a little intro, if you will, so Allison doesn't walk into a cold audience, so to speak. I want to define some terms, and I want to help us just begin to stretch past our assumptions about what is normative when it comes to gender. Now, the word transgender is a big umbrella word, and it covers a lot of different areas of human experience. It gets thrown in with G, L, and B in the GLBT acronym because transgender folks face many of the same kinds of issues around discrimination and harassment that gay, lesbian, and bisexual people do. But being transgender has nothing to do with sexual orientation. It's the first, if you hear nothing else I say this morning, being transgender has nothing to do with sexual orientation. Sexual orientation has to do with who you love or are sexually attracted to, who you form your primary intimate relationships with. A straight woman would form her primary intimate relationship with a man. A gay man would form his primary intimate relationship with another man. A transgender is not about who we love or are attracted to. It's about how we identify our own gender identity, whether we identify as male or female. Obviously, a person who identifies as male can love either men or women, but their gender identity is male. So transgender issues are all about gender identity, not about sexual orientation. And now I want to stop and say also a word about language. The language to keep up with these issues is still evolving. People use different language at different times in different ways. There's been a resurgence of claiming the word queer among the BLGT community, but not everybody likes the word queer. One of the pieces I was reading said, "It is advisable not to use this word to describe other people unless they have told you they welcome your doing so," which I found very amusing. I mean, one of my gay friends describes himself as queer. That's just the word that he prefers to use. Queer can also be used, though, in a much broader sense to describe anything that is at all gender variant from what our norms are. So that's a word that gets used in different ways. But specifically, I want to talk about pronouns. We are a language that is very gender-based, and all of our pronouns are either male or female. For people who identify as both or neither, simply saying he or she is not inclusive enough. So it leads to a challenge as to how to write a sermon and preach a sermon when, as an English major, I am very fussy about grammatical correctness. But the easiest way to do it is simply to use they and their, which are gender neutral, even though technically they're also plural. And I'm going to be using them in the singular, and that's going to drive some of you nuts. But I'm just asking you to bear with me, because it's far more inclusive than saying he or she. I'll say a little more about why not everyone is comfortable with that language later. Now, in its broadest sense, the word transgender is used to refer to anyone whose identity or expression falls outside of stereotypical gender norms. The cultural expectations we have about what's normal for someone of a particular biological sex. Now, most of us are fortunate. We have it easy. Our biological sex, whether we were born male or female, pretty much matches what we understand our gender identity to be. I was born biologically female, and I identify as female. I'm very comfortable as a woman. I fall pretty easily into the gender roles that are assigned to women. That might not have been true 100 years ago, but fortunately there's been significant evolution in what's considered an appropriate gender role for a woman. So I can be very comfortable in my femaleness. My gender identity matches my biological sex. This makes my life quite simple. Remember that gender and sex are two different things. Sex is a biologically determined factor. Hormones, reproductive organs. Even that is sometimes less clear-cut than it appears, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. But sex is biological. Gender is culturally created. Gender is what we think of as masculine or feminine. So you can take a man who is biologically male, but if he's particularly sensitive, we might say he's in touch with his feminine side, because we don't necessarily think of sensitivity as a masculine trait. Fortunately, this is also changing. Until very recently, and probably still in some circles, it was considered a compliment to tell a woman that she had a masculine mind, or that she thought like a man, because sharp analytical thinking was considered a male trait. Gender identity the gender with which a person feels most closely identified, most natural, does not always match a person's biological sex. And when a person who has one biological sex and a different gender identity becomes aware of that difference and chooses to live and dress and behave and present themselves according to the gender that does feel natural, then often they are said to be living as a transgender person, crossing the lines of gender. Now, I also want to say that one of the pieces I read said that the first thing to do if you're talking about trans issues and you're not trans is to speak with humility. So I want to acknowledge I may not have all of this exactly right. I looked at many sources and read many stories, trying to get as full a picture as I can. But any individual's experience could differ from what I'm describing. So bear in mind that transgender experience is as differed as straight experience or white experience or any other category that any of us might fall into, and that some people reject this language altogether. But if we don't try to figure out how to talk about it, we'll never be able to understand the experience of a whole group of people that we're trying to be welcoming to. And it's hard to welcome a group of people whose experience you haven't tried to understand. I'll start with a really trivial example that could be labeled transgender. When I was a kid, I had black figure skates, not white ones. All the kids at the pond made fun of me for wearing boys' skates. Now, at the lowest possible level of interpretation, you could call that transgender behavior. I was wearing boys' skates by choice instead of girls' skates. Of course, that's a trivial example. And in our culture today, women can wear men's clothing. I almost wore a suit, slacks and a jacket, maybe a shirt and tie to illustrate my point. But I'm just such a girly girl, I don't feel comfortable preaching in slacks. I can't do it. But I could, and no one would think anything of it except perhaps me and maybe my mother. Women can wear men's clothing without being considered gender variant these days, but this was not always the case. It used to be considered shocking, immoral, and in many cases illegal for women to wear men's clothing. It was one of the points against Joan of Arc when she was burned at the stake. I bet some of you out there, like me, can remember when girls weren't allowed to wear slacks to public school. How many of you remember those days? We could wear them under our skirts on cold days, but we couldn't take off the skirts. We could wear shorts under our skirts in case we were doing gymnastics on the playground. You couldn't even do that. Well, see, we had to take the long pants off when we got to school, but we could wear them in the bus stop and on the bus to keep from freezing. Gracious of them, I guess. So we had to keep changing back and forth. The standards have stayed much stricter for men. Granted, men can wear pink shirts now. Do we have any men in pink shirts? I was hoping there'd be a man. Yes, excellent. Not wearing it today, but you have one. How many of you guys have a pink shirt? I bet a bunch of you have pink shirts. And nobody laughs at you or says you want to be a girl when you wear your pink shirt, right? Many of you have earrings, whether you're gay or not, and nobody considers it effeminate anymore. But if you, like Jessie, wanted to wear a beautiful skirt that twirled around and that colors blended together like a top, probably everybody would make fun of you. I see that changing, however, especially among our young people, and it gives me tremendous hope. I go to contra dances and contra dance festivals, and a lot of the young men wear skirts for dancing because it's more fun to dance in a skirt, because it twirls around and you can, it just feels better. Some of them are gay, some of them are straight, but a bunch of them, straight or gay, like to wear skirts when they dance. Also, the young men and women at these dances are much less stuck in their gender roles. They'll dance with each other, guys and guys, girls and girls, not worrying about who's straight or gay. That's not the point. Girls will lead, guys will follow, nobody cares. Some of the girls dance together because the boys sweat too much. Nobody cares. There are a couple dancers that I still have not figured out whether they're male or female. And then I have to stop and remind myself that it really doesn't matter. Why do I care? Why do I need to figure out whether male is a guy or a girl? Mel's a great dancer. That's all I care about. But I'm so conditioned to want to put people in those little boxes of M or F, because that's what we always do. Anyway, as I said, I find these young people very refreshing. And when I was talking with one of them about it during a break, I said, it's so encouraging to me to see this here, but I wonder what it's like out in the rest of the world. And he said, but each one of us has a whole group of friends out in the rest of the world that get it and are just like we are. And I said, oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Now, this is not a sermon about why we should welcome transgender people into our congregation, because I really hope we don't need that sermon. if we honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person and accept the free and responsible search for truth and meaning for every person, then of course we welcome transgender people. This is a sermon to help us better understand some of the issues confronting those people so we can honor and respect their life experiences more fully. So I want to point out that the prefix trans has 3 meanings, and they're all relevant here. Trans can mean change, as in transform. Some transgender people choose to change their identities, and sometimes change their bodies in order to better match those identities. The word most commonly used for people who go through that kind of change is transsexual. So a transsexual person has been born into a biological sex that doesn't match their gender identity, and they choose to do something about that. Sometimes simply dressing and presenting to the world as the gender they feel identified with. Other times going on with hormone replacement therapy and possibly surgery in order to biologically change their body to match the gender with which they identify. Many transsexuals sense from a very young age that they are inside the wrong body. And the process of altering the body to match the sense of self can be tremendously liberating, but also tremendously frightening. Now, most of us can't even imagine that experience. But all of us at some time have experienced the pain of being misunderstood in some way. And I want to quote Sean Parker Dennison again. He says, "One doesn't have to be transgender to know how it feels to be crushed into a role or a box that is uncomfortable and painful. This is the heart of every social justice movement. Women know how it feels to be defined in ways that do not hold their strength and value. Anyone whose skin is not white knows how it feels to be limited by others' definitions of their place and power in the world. Gay, lesbian, and bisexual people know how it is to be made small by prejudice and defined by only one small part of their whole being. All of us know, even straight white men with healthy bodies and strong minds, know the pain of being judged and limited by other people's assumptions." No one takes the decision to transition from one gender identity to another lightly. People know that they will lose friends. Many lose their jobs. And as I said earlier, even put their lives at risk. But trying to conform to our culture's norms about one's gender when it feels wrong can be excruciating. I was stunned reading a collection of stories by transgender Unitarian Universalists by how many of them went through incredibly severe depressions, tried to deal with their pain through substance abuse and developed addictions problems, trying to numb the pain of trying to conform, to fit into the box they had been told they belonged in that was not their box. As one friend said to me, "No one does this unless they have to." Now, the second meaning of trans is across, as in transcontinental. Some transgender folks cross back and forth between genders. Maybe they're comfortable being male for the most part, but occasionally like to wear women's clothing. Like Jesse. Jesse was probably quite happy being a boy. He was a boy who wanted to wear a skirt. Didn't mean he wanted to be a girl. He wanted to be a boy in a skirt. Some people might have a female body, but feel a gender identity as male, but not feel the need to change their body to match that gender identity, just most of the time in the world present themselves as male. Now, technically, cross-dressers fit under this piece of the trans umbrella, which includes anyone who likes to wear clothing that our cultural norms assign to the opposite gender. Most people who cross-dress are not necessarily expressing a desire to be that other sex. Men who like Jesse with his skirt, not wanting to be a girl, just wanting to be a boy in a skirt. Because our culture is uncomfortable with this kind of expression, however, most people keep it very private. Drag queens are an obvious exception. Most people wouldn't even necessarily put drag queens under the transgender, officially under the transgender category. They're performers. For many of them, it's a living. For some of them, it may genuinely be also because of pleasure and identity with wearing women's clothing. For others, it's like, when I dress up as a guy for Halloween, it's a performance. So that's a very different category of cross-dressing. But there are many people, many men who enjoy wearing skirts or putting on high heels, I have to say, from my female bias, the one part I don't get is the high heels. I like dresses. I like things that twirl. I like jewelry. I like a little bit of lipstick. I don't like high heels. But, everybody likes their different things. I try not to judge women who wear high heels either, But because cross-dressing carries a stigma, most people who cross-dress try to keep that private, and their families can end up feeling really isolated and really ashamed. One role that we might have as a welcoming congregation is simply to avoid judgment, to realize that anybody has a right to wear whatever they want, whether it's a boy who wants to wear a skirt, or a woman who prefers men's suits, or a man who occasionally likes to put on a pair of heels. Why not? Maybe this could be a place where that was okay. Then the prefix trans can also mean above or beyond, as in transcend. And that may be the hardest piece of this for us to understand because it goes beyond the two little boxes of male and female. Most of us understand male and we understand female, and we can even kind of begin to maybe get a glimpse of what it would be like to be male but want to be female, or be female and want to be male. But some people, for example, are born intersex, which means that their reproductive or sexual anatomy doesn't fit the typical definition of either male or female. They may have elements of both, or one may be more pronounced than the other, but both are there. Something about it is not classically normative of one or the other. For a long time, this was considered a disorder that had to be corrected, usually surgically, when children were very small infants. And doctors and parents sometimes made rather arbitrary choices about whether a child should be a boy or a girl. The repercussions of those surgeries can be lifelong and painful, even though the intent was simply to let the child have as normal a life as possible. Some transsexuals began their life as intersex children and realized later in their life that the wrong choice was made. For those folks, learning that they were born intersex can make sense out of a lifetime of gender discomfort and confusion and shame, because suddenly they understand where it's coming from. Not all transsexuals are born intersex, but some are. The real shame about it is that we live in a culture that just can't handle ambiguity. So we force children into one of two boxes when their body and perhaps their spirit is really some combination of both. Or a blend that becomes neither male nor female, but above and beyond gender as we know it. Despite our great strides towards women's empowerment in our society and gender equality, we are still stunningly gender-based, more so than when I was a child. Walk-through toys are us. Girls' toys, boys' toys. Even Legos now come in girls' colors. Girls are supposed to use the pink Legos, not the red, white, and blue Legos. Everything in the, isn't that revolting? Everything in the girls' aisle is pink. And the classic toys, Tinker Toys and Legos and things have girls' versions. Our children are pushed into gender bias before they're even born. I was working on a baby blanket, knitting away at the doctor's office. Wonderful variegated yarn in rich blues and purples and greens. And the woman behind the counter said, "Oh, it must be for a boy," because it wasn't pink. Not everybody fits neatly into those little boxes marked M or F, as Sean Parker Dennison, my colleague, expresses so eloquently. Whether because they were born intersex or because they have transitioned from one gender identity to another, but still feel part of themselves to retain some of their gender of origin, if you will, or for other reasons beyond our understanding, some people simply can't pick one. They may describe themselves as third gender, or gender neutral, or gender queer. They prefer not to be categorized. That's why I had the conversation about pronouns before I started, because simply saying he or she still leaves some people excluded. The UUA now recommends that if you've got a form that's asking for gender, be sure to have a box marked other, something we might not have thought of 20 years ago. And also to think, do we really need to ask for gender at all? Is it a relevant question? If it is, then provide an alternative. But often it really doesn't matter. Perhaps the most important thing to remember when working on trans issues is very simply not to make assumptions. Don't assume that you know someone is a woman or a man based on your first look or conversation with them. If you're not sure and you're trying to figure out how to refer to them, most trans people would prefer that you just ask, what pronouns do you prefer? And then respect their answer. It may sound painfully obvious, but we need to respect the fact that transgender people are the gender they have decided to be. A person who was born with a female body but who became male is male. And vice versa. A person who chooses to live her life as a woman has the right to be addressed as a woman. This is often not an issue because I've had trans colleagues that I had no idea were trans until I was doing the rooming assignments for a retreat. And Paul said to me, well, I'm perfectly happy to room with Mark, but do you think he'll mind that I'm trans? I said, well, I have no idea. I didn't know you were trans. I doubt if he knows you're trans either. We'll ask him. We asked him. He didn't care. But I would never have known that Paul had begun his life as a woman. Wouldn't have occurred to me. But when we do become aware that someone is making a choice about their gender identity, then we need to honor that choice because people have the right to be self-determining. Most of us have lived all our lives looking at people and putting them in one of two little boxes, the M or the F. And now we're being asked not to do that, to keep an open mind about gender. But remember, we've already learned not to make assumptions about how a person will behave or what they will think or what they can or can't do based on whether they're male or female. We had to learn that. Men are allowed to cry now. Women are allowed to be strong. It's really just one more step to avoid making assumptions about whether someone's male or female in the first place. That's new territory for many of us, and some of it may not be entirely comfortable, but that's okay. Part of what congregations are about is being willing to be uncomfortable as we learn new things. Anytime we choose to welcome diversity, the most important piece is very simple: to allow people to be who they are, to respect their experience, and to help them feel at home. That's what the Welcoming Congregation Initiative is about, and I think that's what Unitarian Universalism is about too. Thank you.